Hello, I'm Maxwell Rothbard, Doc History, and I'm standing here at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. President Johnson, or LBJ as he was affectionately known, commanded our country from 1963 to 1969, during most of the tumultuous decade, but also promising decade of the 1960s. Johnson was born here in Texas, not too far away, in 1908, and grew up very, very poor. He worked his way through college. He actually had a bachelor's degree in education from what is now Texas State University at San Marcos, and ended up working his first few working years as a teacher, primarily in poor Mexican-American communities. Eventually, Johnson was tapped to be a congressional aide, his first exposure to Washington, D.C., and soon he got the attention of many of the other people around him who saw him as a natural leader with a great deal of vision. Johnson soon became a congressman from Texas. In fact, it was during this time that he was in the Navy that he served briefly in the South Pacific during World War II. He was in fact awarded a Silver Star for his role in the Second World War and the gallantry that he showed under attack from Japanese troops. Johnson ran for the United States Senate in 1948. It was in the Senate that Johnson quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a minority leader and then a majority leader, where he was seen as a leader, not just a leader of his own party, but really a leader of the entire Senate and someone who could work with the Eisenhower administration of the 1950s to get things done. John Kennedy in 1960 tapped Lyndon Johnson to be his vice presidential candidate, and together they defeated Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in that year's presidential race. Johnson, as vice president, worked with Kennedy as an influential member of the cabinet, promoting especially America's role in the space program. On November 22, 1963, while on a visit to Dallas, Texas, with Vice President Johnson, President Kennedy was assassinated. In fact, you can see on the Doc History YouTube page the video that we filmed at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Standing at the tarmac in Air Force One on Love Field, President Johnson was sworn in as our nation's 36th Commander-in-Chief. Very quickly, his early achievements, including following through on President Kennedy's tax cuts, or at least proposed tax cuts, and also what he worked on was passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation once and for all. Come, let's look inside. Johnson was an unlikely advocate for civil rights. A Southern white man from Texas, he wouldn't be who you would immediately picture as being one of the great champions for integration in this country, but in fact he was. In 1964, Johnson passed the first of his civil rights acts, banning segregation across the United States. Later, a Civil Rights Act passed by the Johnson administration would ban segregation in voting, opening up new opportunities to African Americans throughout the American South. He also banned discrimination in housing, opening up places for African Americans to live that they had not been able to live before. Johnson's time in office saw perhaps the greatest advancements in civil rights and inequality and civil liberties for African Americans than any other administration since the end of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction period. This is my stop. President Johnson was also a big believer, as we said, in the space program, and really pushed to make sure that within a year of him leaving office in 1969, man had landed on the moon. President Johnson's perhaps his greatest achievements domestically were what he termed his war on poverty and his Great Society, trying to make America the nation that he believed America could be. Two important parts of that were the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid, helping our nation's poor and our nation's elderly achieve health care. Also, what President Johnson was committed to is education. Keep in mind, his background was as a teacher, and he helped start the Head Start program, which brought preschool to so many kids in this nation. President Johnson also established the Department of Transportation, making travel around this country organized and solidifying a lot of the things that President Eisenhower had done when he created the National Highway System. However, there was also more controversy to the Johnson presidency. In 1964, after an attack on American ships, the USS Maddox, in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, he signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution got the United States involved much more so than it had previously been in the Vietnam conflict, and eventually cost the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. There were riots during Johnson's time in office, both protests against the war, but also among African Americans who were living in ghettos and who felt like progress was not moving fast enough, that the civil rights movement was not moving fast enough. It was during Johnson's time as president that Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of 1968, and later Robert Kennedy, the former Attorney General who was campaigning to be the next President of the United States, in June of that year. Johnson, though, saw the nation through it all with a steady hand. And it was Johnson who believed the United States could achieve greatness, that that's what his great society was all about. Johnson chose not to run again for president in 1968, in large part because of a lot of the controversy from the Vietnam War. And he retired to his ranch in Texas, not too far away from here, Stonewall, Texas, where he eventually died in January of 1973. For Doc History, I'm Maxwell Rothbard. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, Lyndon Baines Johnson is tied for being our tallest president, along with Abraham Lincoln. And he used his height and his size to his advantage. Here he's seen giving the Johnson treatment, as it was called, to future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, a man who Johnson, in fact, would appoint to the Supreme Court. Fortas, you may remember from some of our earlier Doc History videos, wrote the majority opinion in the Tinker versus Des Moines U.S. Supreme Court case. To learn about the U.S. Supreme Court case Tinker versus Des Moines, check out my Doc History video here on YouTube.